Hello, my friends. Welcome to 30 Albums for 30 Years, 1964 through 1994. I am your host, Jay Sweet. Today's album, The Rolling Stones, December's Children, and Everybody's. Recorded between August 8th, 1963 through October 26th, 1965. Released on December 3rd, 1965, the same day as The Who's My Generation and the Beatles' Rubber Soul. So let's get into it. Rolling Stones, December's Children, and Everybody's. So as you know, I've discussed the Rolling Stones several times on this program already. For more information, you can go to season number 1, episode 13, where we discuss England's newest hitmakers. Season number 1, episode number 23, The Rolling Stones 12 by 5. Season number 2, episode 6, The Rolling Stones Now. And season number 2, episode 15, The Rolling Stones Out of Our Heads. So I'm just going to give you some brief information now about this release, Rolling Stones, December's Children, and Everybody's. The Rolling Stones, December's Children, and Everybody's is the group's 5th American release, and once again, it's a compilation-style record that includes material from some UK albums, including the UK version of Out of Our Heads. Like all Stones releases to this point, there are some gems, there's some decent cuts, and there's some misses. The Stones were still finding their way as a band at this point. The record reached number 4 in the US and was certified gold. We have already discussed the Rolling Stones at great length on this program, so by now you know the players. Mick Jagger, lead vocals. Keith Richards is on guitar. Brian Jones on guitar, harmonica, and organ. Bill Wyman on bass. Charlie Watts on drums. And at times, Ian Stewart on the piano. Now, much of the appeal from the record came from the hit songs like Get Off of My Cloud and As Tears Go By, both penned by the developing songwriting team of Jagger and Richards. Now, since I've already talked so much about the Stones, I decided to ask somebody to discuss the group with me. And that somebody is New Jersey guitarist and composer Jim Josselyn. Now, you can learn more about Jim on an episode upcoming where I just interviewed Jim on his activities, his music, and his newest releases. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jim Josselyn regarding the Rolling Stones. All right, so yeah, Jim, when I offered you a couple albums to check out, the one you chose was the Rolling Stones' December's Children. And just an overall opinion about the record.
Well, in going back to that record, which I hadn't heard in a while, I found everything I would expect from the early Stones. It's raw, it's fresh, it's young in their development. There's a lot of blues, and you hear a couple hits, right? There's a couple hits there, and some of the elements you could see coming as they progressed and got better and better. I don't think every tune on the album is a winner, and I know that a lot of early Rolling Stones and Beatles albums would have a few great songs and a couple just okay songs.
Right.
So I enjoyed it, though. You kind of hear where they're heading. It's got a vitality, energy, and great early Stones.
Yeah. I mean, just the Stones, like, in general. So, like, that same day that album came out, you know, we had Rubber Soul came out that same day. And so did The Who's debut, My Generation.
Right.
Pretty remarkable. I mean, those are probably the big three, right, of like British 60s era rock and roll. I mean, it doesn't get more iconic than them. And just your opinion of like, everyone always kind of has like the Stones and the Beatles. Your opinion of like kind of where the Beatles were at as opposed to the Stones maybe early on. Do you have anything on that?
Well, sure. A lot of feelings about it. I mean, I didn't know what you just mentioned about those albums being released on the same day. I won't speak too much to the Who. I used to enjoy them a lot more than I do now, but I'll certainly speak to the Beatles. I would think, in my opinion, they were ahead of the Stones at that time. When I first got introduced to the music, I didn't really care for the Beatles as much because it seemed uh, it wasn't raw enough for me. There wasn't enough burning guitar. I liked the energy of the Stones so much more. But as I became a songwriter, I went back and of course, and then really began to respect the Beatles. My opinion about the two bands, I mean, I love them both. I think they're very different. The Beatles are just supreme songwriters, and already at the time of Rubber Soul were that. So
Yeah, I agree, and I think what you said. I think even like it when we were texting back and forth. I think you said something about developing when it comes to the Rolling Stones and this particular album, and certainly the albums that are before. And I think it's certainly true of the Stones. It took them a little while longer to become sort of more polished, and maybe they never were necessarily polished in the same way that maybe the Beatles were, somewhat sanitized by their studio efforts. Not, because they really put a lot of attention to the records, of course.
sure,
And the Stones had this certain, rawness and energy, and almost like the anti-Beatles for a little time.
yes. Well,
Uh,
one thing I always think about with the early period of the Stones, and I imagine it probably sort of came about right after December's Children. I love that period with Brian Jones where he'd pick up a recorder and be able to play it, or a vibraphone, or a sitar, and you would just hear these different exotic sounds that perfectly fit a song. That was the only time in the band they had that sort of thing for that brief period after December's Children, and I love that about the early Stones.
yeah, I think that's a great point. And like, from a guitar player standpoint, can you speak to the playing of maybe Brian Jones and Keith Richards as well?
I can. I mean, it's rhythm and lead. Blues, rock, rhythm guitar, and rhythm and lead guitar at its finest, really, for that era and that genre. I would say though that I think my favorite guitar player to ever play in the Stones was Mick Taylor.
Yeah.
Shortly after that, I mean, he could really play. Sticky Fingers, I think, is a great guitar album, a great rock guitar album of all time, and I think a large part of that is due to Mick Taylor.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's one of the unsung heroes, perhaps.
For sure.
And
Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
think there's any comparison between him and any of the other, in terms of a technical standpoint. Um, I agree with you.
Yeah. Can't you hear me knocking? The
Awesome.
things he plays on that, it's soulful.
Right, but Jones had a certain creativity, and I know at this point he was becoming a little bit fractured from what the Stones were trying to do, and of course he didn't live very long. But his use of some of the Indian kind of melodies that were kind of becoming popular in the 1960s, mid 1960s, and he used the sitar, and again he was like a multi instrumentalist.
Yeah.
Uh, so there's a certain energy that he had during that period, and like you said, I think the album it's like completely unbalanced, but yet there's like there's some classics. Get Off My Cloud, their version of As Tears Go By, which is pretty unique, I think, just in the sense where it's just Jagger and Richards, and I think that's the first time they really experimented with a string orchestra. There was certainly an intent on that song.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful recording. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's iconic, and it just sounds like them, right? Only they would sound like that.